In 1895, a man walked into his Fifth Avenue townhouse, kissed his wife, asked about the children, and then took a cab downtown to a second apartment, where a second woman was raising a second child he had fathered. He paid for both households. He attended both families' milestones. He maintained two complete lives for over a decade, and nobody said a word. Not because nobody knew, because in the Gilded Age, silence was not ignorance, it was a transaction. And the price of keeping quiet was always cheaper than the cost of telling the truth. This is the story of three men who built parallel worlds with parallel families, sustained by fortunes so vast that the cost of a second life was a rounding error. Until death, divorce, or a deathbed confession collapsed the architecture of silence. If stories like this remind you why the history books always leave out the most important parts, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Chapter 1. The Most Powerful Banker. Had two sons. James Stillman controlled more money than most nations, but he could not control a secret that would cost him everything. By the first decade of the 20th century, National City Bank was the largest financial institution in the United States, and James A. Stillman sat at its center. His father, the original James Stillman, had built the bank into a colossus of American finance, a machine that moved capital between railroads, steel mills, oil companies, and the government itself. The elder Stillman cultivated silence as a business strategy. He spoke rarely, appeared seldom, and controlled everything. His fortune was estimated at more than $50 million. The son inherited the institution. He inherited the fortune. And he inherited the expectation that he would embody the Gilded Age ideal: wealth worn quietly, authority exercised without spectacle, respectability maintained at all costs. In 1901, James A. Stillman married Anne Urquhart Potter at Grace Church in Manhattan. Society knew her as Fifi. She was the daughter of James Brown Potter, a figure of sufficient social standing to make the match unimpeachable. The wedding was reported in every society column in New York. The couple took their place among the city's financial elite. They had children. They summered in the right places. They maintained a property in Grande Anse, Quebec, and somewhere downtown, in a separate apartment that did not appear in the social register or the society pages, a woman named Florence Leeds was raising a son. Florence was a Broadway chorus girl. In the strict hierarchy of Gilded Age womanhood, she occupied the lowest rung that could still attract a man of Stillman's stature. She was not a socialite. She was not a widow of means. She was a young woman who had entered an arrangement that would define her life. The son's name was J. Ward Leeds. His father's name was James Stillman. The arrangement was sustained by a financial architecture as carefully constructed as the bank's own ledgers. Stillman funded Florence's household through channels that kept his name off the paper trail. The money moved through intermediaries. It arrived as paid rent, as accounts at stores, as cash delivered by men who understood that their employment depended on discretion. The separate household required between $15,000 and $45,000 per year. In today's money, Stillman was spending between $500,000 and $1.5 million annually to keep a second family hidden. But hidden from whom? In the Gilded Age, hidden did not mean unknown. It meant unspoken. The servants knew, the cab drivers knew, the doormen at both addresses knew. Colonel William D'Alton Mann, the publisher of Town Topics, almost certainly knew. Mann's magazine was the most widely read in New York society, though no one would admit to subscribing. His business model was blackmail, dressed as journalism. When his informants uncovered an affair or an illegitimate child, he approached the subject and offered an opportunity to invest in his company. William K. Vanderbilt paid $25,000. J.P. Morgan paid $2,500. Dr. Seward Webb paid $14,000. The payments confirmed that the secrets were real and the fear of exposure was worth almost any price. Gilded Age New York operated on an unwritten social contract. Public respectability was everything. A man could do anything in private as long as the public performance remained flawless. Attend the opera on Monday with your wife. Visit your mistress on Tuesday. Appear at church on Wednesday. The compartments were absolute. Everyone who participated in the arrangement benefited from its continuation. The social register was the gatekeeper. Published annually, It listed the families that mattered. If your name appeared, you existed. If it did not, you were invisible. Florence Leeds' name never appeared. J. Ward Leeds' name never appeared. In the social register's taxonomy, they did not exist. The book that defined New York society was also the book that made double lives possible, because it drew an absolute line between the visible and the hidden. For years, Stillman's arrangement worked. The two households operated in parallel. Fifi raised their children on Fifth Avenue. Florence raised Jay downtown. Stillman moved between the two worlds with the efficiency he brought to managing the bank's capital flows. The money moved, the silence held, and nobody asked the obvious question: what happens when one world discovers the other? Chapter 2. The Chorus Girl on the Other Side of Town. Florence Leeds never appeared in the social register, but she received a monthly payment that rivaled most society wives' allowances. The financial architecture of a Gilded Age double life was remarkably sophisticated. A man of Stillman's visibility could not write checks to a Broadway chorus girl without creating a trail. The money had to be invisible, and invisibility in the Gilded Age was something you could purchase if you had enough of it. The system that sustained Florence was not unique to Stillman. Across Manhattan, wealthy men maintained women in apartments funded by trust payments, monthly allowances, and discreet transfers. The stretch of Broadway between 23rd and 42nd Streets, known as Soubrette Row, was the marketplace where these arrangements began. Chorus girls and actresses entered financially dependent relationships with men who provided apartments, jewels, and a version of security that came with no legal standing whatsoever. J.P. Morgan exemplified the pattern. He maintained a string of mistresses throughout his marriage, preferring married women with a Mrs. before her name because they could be invited anywhere without suspicion. His wife Fanny knew. She wrote about Mrs. R in her diary, referring to Edith May Randolph. Morgan built a house on Park Avenue for his last long-term mistress, Adelaide Douglas, designed by architect Horace Trumbauer. He stashed other mistresses at Bar Harbor while attending church at St. Saviour's Episcopal on Sundays. What made Stillman's case different was scale. He was not keeping a mistress for companionship. He was funding a household. He was raising a son. He had built a second domestic life that functioned as a family. Florence existed in a social void. She could not attend the functions where Stillman appeared with Fifi. She could not introduce Jay to Stillman's other children. Under New York law, she had no standing as a wife. Jay had no standing as an heir unless Stillman chose to provide it. This was the fundamental asymmetry of the Gilded Age double life. The man held all the power. He could sustain both families or abandon either one at will. The first wife had the legal protection of marriage, but no ability to compel fidelity. The second woman had the financial protection of the arrangement, but no legal recourse if it collapsed. And the children born on the wrong side of the line were, in the legal terminology of the era, filius nullius, the children of nobody. J. Ward Leeds was the child of nobody. He had a mother who loved him, a father who funded him, and a legal system that did not know he existed. The irony was devastating. Stillman's legitimate children bore the name of one of the most powerful banking dynasties in America. They would inherit trust funds, social positions, and entry into every club and institution the Gilded Age valued. Jay bore the name Leeds, which connected him to nothing. He would inherit only what his father chose to give him, and his father's choice could change at any moment. The contrast was a daily cruelty that compounded over years. Every time Jay asked about his father, Florence had to choose between truth and safety. Every time she passed a newspaper with Stillman's photograph, she saw the public face of a man whose private face she knew in a different light. Every time Fifi Stillman appeared in the society columns, dressed in the latest fashion, attending the latest ball, Florence measured the distance between her own life and the life that wealth and a marriage certificate provided. Florence understood this asymmetry. She had entered the arrangement with open eyes. She knew the rules, she knew the risks. She knew that the monthly payments could stop, that the apartment could be reclaimed, that the man who visited could one day simply not arrive. Her security depended entirely on Stillman's continued interest. And interests in the Gilded Age, as in every age, were subject to change. What Florence may not have anticipated was that the arrangement's greatest threat would come not from Stillman's indifference, but from his ambition. The catastrophe that would destroy both families began not with a betrayal, but with a legal filing. Stillman did not abandon Florence. He tried to abandon Fifi, and Fifi fought back with the only weapon she had, the truth about Florence Leeds. Chapter 3: The Divorce That Destroyed Them Both. In 1921, James Stillman filed for divorce and lit a fuse that would blow apart two families at once. The decision was catastrophic. For years, the arrangement had held because Stillman observed the first rule of Gilded Age transgression: never make it public. The system did not demand fidelity. It demanded silence. The moment Stillman walked into a courtroom, he violated that rule and invited retaliation from a woman who knew exactly where to aim. His complaint was specific and explosive. He accused Fifi of adultery with Fred Beauvais, a man of mixed Indigenous and French-Canadian heritage who worked as a guide and superintendent at the Stillman family's property in Grande Anse, Quebec. Stillman alleged that Fifi's youngest son, Guy, who was 20 months old, was not his child, but Beauvais'. The accusation was designed to secure a divorce on the only grounds New York law permitted: adultery, and to strip Fifi of custody and leverage. The accusation carried an additional charge the newspapers could not resist. It crossed racial and class lines simultaneously. Fred Beauvais was described in the press as a half-blood Indian guide. The implication was clear. Fifi had not merely been unfaithful. She had been unfaithful with a man who, in the social hierarchy, occupied a position so far beneath her that the transgression was doubly scandalous. Beauvais himself was publicly humiliated. His life became tabloid fodder. He gave interviews stating that Stillman had neglected his wife, a quiet counter-accusation the newspapers treated as confirmation. But the real explosion came from Fifi's lawyers. They named Florence Leeds. They named J. Ward Leeds. They alleged that Stillman had fathered a son with a chorus girl while married to Fifi. They provided evidence. They turned the mirror around and forced the most powerful banker in America to see his own reflection. The trial became the most sensational divorce case of the decade. Newspapers across the country published every detail. The New York dailies ran cover stories with photographs of all the principals: Stillman and Fifi side by side, Florence Leeds and Fred Beauvais side by side. The disputed children, Guy and Jay, presented as evidence of mutual betrayal. The proceedings dragged on for 5 years. 5 years of depositions, motions, counter-motions, and front-page headlines. The legal costs exceeded $1 million. Lawyers on both sides submitted thousands of pages of testimony. Witnesses were summoned from Quebec, from New York, from wherever the trail led. Stillman hired private investigators to prove Beauvais was Guy's father. Fifi's lawyers produced evidence of Stillman's visits to Florence Leeds, his payments, his paternal relationship with Jay. The newspapers treated the trial as entertainment. The New York American ran daily updates. The Tribune printed photographs. The tabloids invented nicknames. Stillman was forced to resign from the presidency of National City Bank. The institution he had inherited, the institution his father had built into the most powerful bank in America, could not afford the association. His professional reputation, built over a lifetime of careful silence, was destroyed by the scandal he had tried to control. The bank's board did not ask him to leave because they disapproved of his behavior. They asked him to leave because his behavior had become public. That was the only sin the Gilded Age recognized. The court's verdict was devastating. The judge refused Stillman's divorce petition on the grounds that he himself had committed adultery. You cannot accuse your wife of maintaining a secret child while maintaining one of your own. The law, for once, applied symmetrically. Fifi withdrew her countersuit after receiving a $500,000 necklace, a reconciliation gift that was really a settlement by another name. The couple briefly reunited. It did not last. Fifi divorced Stillman in 1931 and married Fowler McCormick, a man 20 years her junior. In 1926, Stillman formally acknowledged J. Ward Leeds as his son. He established a trust of $20,000 per year until Jay reached 21. The acknowledgement came too late to matter legally and too late to undo the damage. The financial wreckage was staggering. Stillman's legal fees exceeded $1 million, roughly $30 million in today's money. Fifi's lawyers were equally expensive. The private investigators, the depositions, the expert witnesses, the court filings that filled entire rooms. The divorce industry that would later become routine in American life was, in 1921, still a spectacle, and the Stillman case was its most expensive production. The aftermath reveals the cost beyond dollars. Florence Leeds disappeared from public records almost entirely. She had served her purpose in the trial, a weapon wielded by Fifi's lawyers, and once the trial ended, she returned to the invisibility that had defined her existence. Jay grew up with his father's money and his father's late acknowledgement, but without the Stillman name, the Stillman connections, or the Stillman social position his half-siblings inherited by birthright. The Stillman case proved something the Gilded Age always knew, but never admitted. The double life was not one man's aberration. It was a system, and sometimes both partners operated within it. Chapter 4. A sham marriage to hide a tycoon's son. When Arabella Yarrington's son was born in March 1870, his father was one of the richest men in America, and his birth certificate carried another man's name. Collis Huntington was one of the Big Four. Along with Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, he built the Central Pacific Railroad, the western half of the first transcontinental line that connected the Atlantic to the Pacific in 1869. The fortune this created was staggering. At his death in 1900, Huntington's estate was estimated at $50 million, roughly $1.6 billion in today's money. He controlled railroads, steamship lines, real estate holdings across multiple states, and political influence that stretched from state legislatures to the United States Congress. He was also, almost certainly, the father of a child born to a young woman named Arabella Yarrington in New York City. Arabella's origins are obscured by the deliberate silence that wealth can purchase. She was born around 1850, probably in Virginia, almost certainly of modest means. By the late 1860s, she was in New York, in her late teens or early 20s, and in a relationship with a married railroad magnate approaching 50. The child was born in March 1870. The birth certificate listed his father as John Worsham. The marriage to Worsham was engineered specifically to give the baby a legitimate surname. John Worsham was a man from Richmond, Virginia, who already had a legal wife named Annette. He traveled to New York, married Arabella, signed the relevant documents, and returned almost immediately to Virginia. The sham lasted barely long enough for the ink to dry, but the name stuck. The child was Archer Milton Worsham. On paper, he was the son of a man who had never intended to be his father and never saw him again. In reality, he was the son of a man who controlled the Central Pacific Railroad. The scale of what Huntington was hiding should be measured in dollars. His share of the Central Pacific alone was worth millions. The Southern Pacific Railroad, which he later controlled, stretched across 7 states. His real estate holdings in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York were vast. A man with this much to protect did not leave a child's paternity to chance. He engineered a solution, the way he engineered a railroad: identify the obstacle, calculate the cost, build the infrastructure, and move forward. The Worsham marriage cost almost nothing: a favor from a willing participant, a ceremony that created a document, the document created a name, the name created a wall between Collis Huntington and the child he had fathered. For the price of a fake marriage, Huntington purchased decades of plausible deniability. The Worsham marriage was not unprecedented. Across the Gilded Age, wealthy men arranged sham marriages, proxy marriages, and marriages of convenience to solve the problem of illegitimate children. The practice was common enough that certain clergymen developed reputations for performing ceremonies without asking inconvenient questions. Certain lawyers specialized in structuring the paperwork. Certain doctors understood that a birth certificate was a document to be managed, not merely recorded. The infrastructure of concealment was as established as the banking system that funded it. The arrangement required collaborators, a clergyman who performed the ceremony without asking why the groom departed the next morning, a doctor who signed the birth certificate without noting the discrepancy, lawyers who structured financial support to flow from Huntington to Arabella without creating a direct link, servants who maintained silence about the man who visited regularly and paid for everything. People noticed. Archer was described by contemporaries as Collis's splitting image. The physical resemblance was too strong to ignore and too dangerous to discuss. In Gilded Age New York, remarking on a powerful man's illegitimate child was an invitation to financial and social destruction. Nobody with power had reason to expose the fiction. The scale of what Huntington was protecting extended far beyond one child. The Central Pacific Railroad alone employed thousands. The Southern Pacific stretched from New Orleans to Portland, carrying freight and passengers across 7 states. Huntington's lobbying operation in Washington was legendary. He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars cultivating senators and congressmen who would protect the railroad from regulation, taxation, and competitors. His enemies in Congress called him a corruptionist. His friends called him a visionary. Both were correct. A man who operated at this level of political and economic power could not afford a paternity scandal. The sham Worsham marriage was not excessive caution. It was the minimum required to protect an empire. The arrangement also required Arabella to accept a social position that was exquisitely painful. She was not poor. She was not neglected. She lived in comfort that most women of her era could not imagine. But comfort is not the same as legitimacy. She could not call herself Mrs. Huntington. She could not appear at his side at the opera or at dinner parties where his business partners gathered with their wives. She occupied a space that had no name in polite society. She was not a wife. She was not a widow. She was not a spinster. She was a woman with a child and a benefactor. And in the rigid taxonomy of Gilded Age womanhood, that category did not exist. For the next 2 decades, the arrangement functioned. Arabella lived in New York in a townhouse funded by Huntington's railroad fortune. She raised Archer. She built social connections. She cultivated the taste that would later make her one of the most important collectors of her era. She was, in every functional sense, Huntington's second wife. She attended to the domestic life he did not share with Elizabeth Stoddard Huntington, his legal wife, who had been married to him since 1844. The cost of maintaining Arabella's household was substantial but manageable. Her lifestyle matched the social tier she aspired to. The townhouse alone cost several $1,000s per year. Servants, a governess for Archer, clothing appropriate to the social tier she was cultivating. Art purchases that served both aesthetic and strategic purposes. Charitable donations that bought goodwill. The expenses ran into tens of thousands of dollars per year. Huntington's annual income from the railroads exceeded $2 million. Arabella's household was a budget line he could absorb without strain. He spent more on a single congressional lobbying campaign than he spent on Arabella in a decade. But the emotional cost was not a rounding error. Archer grew up knowing, or gradually learning, that the man who visited regularly, who paid for everything, who bore a striking physical resemblance to him, was not the man named on his birth certificate. He attended schools where the other boys carried names that opened doors: Vanderbilt, Astor, Whitney. He carried the name Worsham, which opened nothing. The name belonged to a man he had never met. A man who had signed a document in a room in New York and then disappeared back to Virginia, and his real wife. The secret was the worst kept in Gilded Age New York. Everyone could see the truth. Nobody could speak it. Chapter 5, 20 Years as a Kept Woman on Fifth Avenue. For 2 decades, Arabella lived in a townhouse Collis paid for, raised a son Collis had fathered, and waited for a wife she had never met to die. The patience required was extraordinary. The legal framework that sustained the arrangement was not. Under New York's bastardy statutes, an illegitimate child was filius nullius, the child of nobody. Archer had no legal claim on Huntington's estate unless Huntington voluntarily provided one. He could not inherit through blood. He could not challenge the will. He existed in a legal void that only his father's goodwill could fill. This gave Huntington absolute power. He could sustain Arabella and Archer indefinitely, or walk away. No contract, no marriage, no obligation existed that could be enforced in court. The entire structure rested on one man's word, backed by one man's money. Arabella understood this. Her response was strategy, not despair. Over 20 years, she transformed herself from a woman of obscure origins into a figure of cultural sophistication. She cultivated relationships with art dealers, learning the market for old masters and decorative arts. She educated herself in connoisseurship, developing an eye for quality that would later place her among the most important collectors of her generation. She built connections to society figures. She was not idle. She was building the social capital that would protect her if the financial arrangement collapsed. By the early 1880s, Arabella's reputation as a collector was established in circles that mattered. She had developed relationships with the dealers who served the Vanderbilts, the Morgans, and the Astors. She had taste, she had knowledge, she had the social skills to move without revealing the precariousness of her position. All of this was funded by Huntington. All of it was designed to make the transition, when it came, seamless. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Stoddard Huntington lived separately. Whether she knew about Arabella is debated. Whether she could challenge the arrangement is not. Under coverture, Elizabeth had no independent legal existence. She could not own property in her own right. She could not hire lawyers to investigate her husband's finances. The most she could do was maintain her position and trust the system. The Gilded Age provided a framework for women in Arabella's position. J.P. Morgan maintained mistresses throughout his marriage. His wife knew and endured it. The difference between Morgan's arrangements and Arabella's was duration and depth. Morgan's women were companions. Arabella was a parallel wife raising a parallel son. The arrangement was not an affair, it was a household. And Arabella used the time. She did not spend 20 years in passive waiting. She spent them building the social infrastructure that would make her transition from kept woman to wife seamless when the opportunity arrived. She began collecting art seriously in the 1870s. Acquiring paintings and decorative objects from dealers who served the city's wealthiest families. She developed relationships with Joseph Duveen and other prominent dealers. She learned to evaluate quality with an eye that impressed professionals. By the time Collis was free to marry her, Arabella had transformed herself from a woman with nothing into a woman whose taste, knowledge, and social connections made her a credible partner for one of the richest men in the country. The strategy was brilliant. She could not earn legitimacy through birth or marriage, so she earned it through connoisseurship. The emotional toll fell on everyone except Collis. Arabella spent 20 years in a liminal social space, present enough to matter, absent enough to avoid scandal. She could not attend functions where Elizabeth appeared. She could not claim Collis publicly. She could not refer to Archer as Collis's son. The performance required constant calibration. A single misstep, a single indiscreet comment at a dinner party, a single appearance at an event where Elizabeth was expected, could collapse the entire structure. Arabella had to track not only her own social calendar, but Elizabeth's. She had to know which restaurants Collis's business associates frequented, which box at the opera was visible from which angle, which charity galas would draw the wrong eyes. The logistics of invisibility were a full-time occupation. The daily logistics of the arrangement were a performance in themselves. Collis could not arrive at Arabella's door in his own carriage without risking recognition. He could not send letters through the regular post. He could not invite Arabella to dine at Delmonico's, or attend the theater in a box where his business associates might see them. Every visit required planning. Every encounter required an exit strategy. The servants in both households were carefully selected for discretion. The coachmen who drove him downtown were paid enough to forget where they had been. Archer grew up in a household that was comfortable but illegitimate. The man who visited regularly, who funded everything, was not the man on his birth certificate. The Worsham name was a stranger's name. His real father's name was Huntington, but he could not use it, could not claim it, could not speak it publicly. He was educated well. Arabella made sure of that. She raised him with the cultivation that would later define his life. He learned languages. He studied art and history. He developed the intellectual curiosity that would eventually produce the Hispanic Society of America. Everything Arabella gave Archer was designed to make him the kind of man the Huntington name deserved, long before the name was legally his. 20 years is a long time to live inside a lie. Arabella waited. She refined her strategy. She raised Archer to be the kind of man who could succeed in the world she intended to enter. And in 1883, the variable she had been waiting for finally changed. Elizabeth Stoddard Huntington died. Chapter 6. The Adoption That Rewrote History. When Elizabeth Huntington died in 1883, Collis did not grieve for long. Within a year, on July 22, 1884, Collis married Arabella. The ceremony made public what had been private for over 2 decades. The kept woman became the wife. The shadow household became the official residence. But the marriage was only half the project. The other half was Archer. Collis legally adopted Archer Worsham, then 14 years old. The adoption erased the fiction of the Worsham marriage and replaced it with a new fiction, that Archer was Collis's adopted son rather than his biological one. It was a legal formality dressed as generosity. The adoption gave Archer the Huntington name, the Huntington inheritance rights, and the Huntington social standing that his birth certificate had denied him for 14 years. The operation was executed with the precision of a railroad construction project. Collis had spent 30 years building transcontinental lines by solving logistical problems with money and patience. The problem of an illegitimate son was one more logistical challenge. The sham marriage was the temporary bridge. The adoption was the permanent track. The marriage to Arabella was the station at the end of the line. Each step cost money, but created value. The sham Worsham marriage cost a favor. The adoption cost legal fees and the social risk of acknowledging a child whose origins were widely suspected. The marriage cost whatever Elizabeth's death had settled. The returns were enormous. Collis got legitimacy for the family he had always wanted. Arabella got legal standing she had spent 2 decades earning. Archer got a name, an inheritance, and a future. When Collis died on August 13, 1900, at Camp Pine Knot in the Adirondacks, the inheritance confirmed the plan's success. Arabella received more than $50 million. In today's money, the sum exceeds $1.6 billion. She became one of the wealthiest women in America. And she did not stop there. In 1913, Arabella married Henry Edwards Huntington, Collis's nephew. Henry had managed Collis's Los Angeles streetcar operations and had built a real estate fortune of his own. The marriage consolidated 2 branches of the Huntington wealth into a single dynasty. Together, Arabella and Henry assembled one of the most extraordinary private art collections in American history. Arabella's decades of study paid dividends that stagger the imagination. She and Henry purchased Gainsborough's Blue Boy for $728,000, the highest price ever paid for a painting at the time. They acquired works by Reynolds, Romney, Lawrence, and Constable. They filled their San Marino estate with rare books, manuscripts, and first editions that scholars would spend the next century studying. Archer inherited millions. He became a respected philanthropist and scholar of extraordinary range. He founded the Hispanic Society of America in 1904, endowing it with his own collection of Spanish and Portuguese art, manuscripts, maps, and artifacts. He spoke fluent Spanish and Arabic. He funded archaeological expeditions across the Iberian Peninsula. He commissioned Joaquin Sorolla to paint 14 enormous murals depicting the regions of Spain, a series that took 8 years to complete. He married Anna Hyatt, the sculptor, whose bronze works stand in public parks and plazas across the world. He lived until 1955, dying at 85, a man of deep culture and serious intellectual achievement whose entire existence had been premised on a cover story invented before he could walk. The Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California, stands as one of the finest research institutions in the world. Scholars travel from around the globe to use its resources. The collections include a Gutenberg Bible, a manuscript of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, early editions of Shakespeare, and over 11 million items spanning British and American history. The Botanical Gardens cover 120 acres. The endowment runs into the billions. None of the tasteful plaques mention that the fortune flowed through a woman who spent 20 years as a kept mistress, raising a son whose birth certificate carried a fake father's name. None of them note that the founder's wife was once a young woman of no social standing who accepted a financial arrangement with a married man twice her age. None of them explain that the adopted son's real birth certificate listed a stranger as his father. The institution exists because a lie was told in 1870, maintained for 14 years, and then replaced with a better lie in 1884. Consider what the Huntington story means beside the Stillman story. Stillman tried to escape his marriage through the legal system and was destroyed. Huntington waited for death to dissolve his first marriage and was rewarded with a clean transfer. The difference was not moral, it was tactical. Stillman tried to force the system. Huntington let it work in its own time. Stillman was impatient. Huntington was a railroad builder. He understood that the distance between 2 points is covered not by speed, but by patience. The cost was borne by the people who had no power to set the timetable. Elizabeth lived and died as the official wife of a man whose true domestic life was in another borough. Arabella spent 20 years in a townhouse funded by a man who could not give her his name. Archer spent 14 years carrying a name that belonged to a stranger. The patience that made the plan work was Collis's virtue. The suffering it required was everyone else's burden. The Huntington case offers a final, bitter lesson about the difference between patience and justice. Collis did not do the right thing. He did the strategic thing. He waited until circumstances allowed him to legitimize what he had built in secret. The women and children in his life were moved like pieces on a board. Elizabeth was the piece that needed to be removed. Arabella was the piece that needed to be promoted. Archer was the piece that needed a new name. The game was played over 30 years, and Collis won it completely. This is the case that breaks the pattern. The kept woman became the wife. The illegitimate son became the heir. The fortune transferred. The lie became the truth, because nobody with the power to challenge it chose to. Chapter 7. The Newspaper King Who Could Not Buy a Divorce. William Randolph. Hearst controlled 28 newspapers, 18 magazines, and a film studio, but he could not control his own marriage. By 1917, Hearst was 54 and the most powerful media figure in America. His newspapers shaped opinion from New York to San Francisco. He had run for governor and for mayor. He built San Simeon at an estimated cost of $30 million. His art collection filled warehouses. His parties attracted Hollywood royalty and political leaders. He was also irrevocably entangled with Marion Davies. Marion was a Ziegfeld girl, blonde and vivacious, with a stutter she tried to hide and a warmth she never could. She was 20 when they met. He was 54. Hearst adored her. He promoted her film career through his newspapers and Cosmopolitan Productions, spending millions on movies. The relationship was an open secret in Hollywood and the newspaper world, but Hearst was married. He had wed Millicent Wilson in 1903. She had been a showgirl herself when they met. She was 16, he was 34. The marriage produced 5 sons, and Millicent, once installed as Mrs. Hearst, proved to be exactly the kind of wife the Gilded Age produced. She took the name, the position, the money, and refused to let any of it go. Hearst wanted Marion. He could not have her legally, because Millicent would not give him a divorce. The reasons were layered. Financial. A divorce would require splitting a fortune that was enormous but dangerously overextended. The Hearst media empire ran on leverage and ambition, not on cash reserves. His spending was compulsive. San Simeon alone cost more than $30 million to build and furnish. His art buying was so prolific that entire warehouses in the Bronx were filled with crates he had never opened. A settlement could force liquidations that might collapse the empire. A judge dividing the assets might discover what the accountants already knew, that the fortune was wider than it was deep. Social. Millicent was Mrs. William Randolph Hearst. She ran the Free Milk Fund for Babies, one of New York's most prominent charities. She sat on boards. She entertained congressmen. She controlled significant family assets. She had 5 sons, all of whom bore the Hearst name, and all of whom would inherit the media empire. Millicent's social position was real and hard-won. It could not be replaced by a settlement check, and perhaps something deeper. Millicent had been a showgirl when Hearst married her. She was 16 when they met, a girl in the chorus line at the Herald Square Theater. He was 34, already building his newspaper empire. He saw something in her. She saw everything in him. The marriage in 1903 was her entry into a world she had no birthright to enter. Over the next 2 decades, she remade herself into a society matron, a philanthropist, a mother. The title Mrs. Hearst was not merely a social position. It was proof that she had earned her place. Surrendering it would mean admitting the transformation was reversible, that underneath it all, she was still the girl from the chorus line. The refusal to divorce was identity preservation as much as financial calculation. San Simeon was the physical manifestation of the stalemate. Hearst built it on a hilltop overlooking the Pacific, spending decades on construction that was never truly finished. The estate had 165 rooms, 127 acres of gardens, indoor and outdoor swimming pools, a private zoo with zebras and polar bears, and an airfield for guests who flew in from Los Angeles. The parties were legendary. A weekend invitation to San Simeon was the most coveted social ticket in America. Stars, politicians, writers, and foreign dignitaries mingled in rooms filled with medieval tapestries, Roman sarcophagi, and art treasures Hearst had purchased from bankrupt European estates. Marian was the hostess, not Millicent. Marian poured the drinks, set the seating, managed the social dynamics, and charmed the guests. She was the wife in everything but the one thing that mattered. The result was a stalemate lasting nearly 4 decades. Hearst lived with Marian at San Simeon, entertaining Charlie Chaplin, Winston Churchill, and whoever else received an invitation to what some called the greatest house party in America. Millicent lived as Mrs. Hearst in New York, running her charities, raising her sons, attending Mass at St. Thomas More. Neither would yield. The arrangement was bizarre, widely known, and completely stable, because the only person who could break it refused to. The consequences rippled outward. Hearst could not marry Marian. He could not give her legal standing. She remained his companion, his mistress, his partner in everything except the law. She hosted his parties. She managed his household. She nursed him through illnesses. She gave up her own career ambitions to be available whenever he needed her. She did everything a wife does, except exist on paper. Hollywood knew. Every studio head, every director, every actor who visited San Simeon understood the arrangement. Luella Parsons, Hearst's gossip columnist, protected the secret by never printing it. Other columnists followed suit because crossing Hearst meant losing access to his papers, and losing access meant losing readership. The silence that protected Hearst was not purchased with cash, like Colonel Mann's silences. It was purchased with fear. 28 newspapers is a weapon that does not need to be fired to be effective. And when the crisis came, when the pregnancy that could not be acknowledged arrived, the lack of legal standing meant the child would have to disappear. Chapter 8. A Baby. Sent to Paris, and a sister who raised her. Around 1919, Marian Davies became pregnant, and the most powerful media mogul in America could not allow anyone to know. The pregnancy was an existential threat. Hearst was legally married. Marian was his mistress. A child would create a paper trail, a legal liability, and a scandal that even 28 newspapers could not suppress. Millicent's lawyers would use it in any future proceedings. The pregnancy had to disappear. According to Patricia Lake's son, Arthur Lake Jr., the concealment was planned with precision. Marian was sent to France, ostensibly for a holiday. The cover story was simple enough to be believed. An actress taking a European trip was unremarkable. The film industry shut down production schedules routinely. Nobody in Hollywood would question a few months' absence. And in Paris, away from American newspapers, away from Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper, and the gossip machinery that ran on proximity, Marian could disappear into the anonymous crowds of a foreign city. She gave birth to a daughter. The timing was critical. The pregnancy had to be hidden from the moment it became visible. Marian was a public figure. Her photograph appeared in newspapers and magazines. She attended premieres, parties, and public events as Hearst's companion. A visible pregnancy would have been impossible to explain. The trip to Paris solved the problem with elegant simplicity. She left America before anyone could see. She returned after the baby was safely placed with Rose. The cover story exploited a coincidence of tragedy. Marian's sister Rose had recently lost a baby. Patricia was registered as the daughter of Rose and George Van Cleve. On paper, she was Marian's niece. In every legal document, every school record, every passport, she carried the Van Cleve name. The baby was brought back to America and raised in the Van Cleve household. Marian was a constant presence, the devoted aunt who visited with a frequency no ordinary aunt would sustain. She paid for everything. She attended every milestone. She brought gifts that were too expensive for an aunt and too frequent for a casual relative. She looked at the child with an intensity that people noticed but did not remark upon, because remarking meant questioning Marian Davies, and questioning Marian Davies meant questioning William Randolph Hearst. The financial support flowed through Marian, avoiding a paper trail between the mogul and the child. Marian had substantial income from her career and from Hearst's support. At her peak, Hearst was spending over $7 million on her films through Cosmopolitan Productions. Her personal allowance was enormous. The money that reached Patricia was laundered through layers of family obligation that looked ordinary from the outside. The arrangement required the active cooperation of the entire Davies family. Rose and George Van Cleve raised Patricia as their own. Marion's other sisters knew. The family closed ranks. The Davies women understood that Hearst's money funded not just Patricia, but the entire family's standard of living. To expose the secret was to destroy the source. The incentive structure was airtight. Hearst was present too. He and Marion lived together at San Simeon and in their Beverly Hills estate. Patricia was part of their orbit, close enough to see both biological parents regularly. She attended gatherings where Hollywood stars milled about, where Charlie Chaplin performed impromptu routines and Clark Gable made small talk. She was surrounded by fame, wealth, and glamour that technically had nothing to do with her and everything to do with who she really was. But the rules were absolute. She was the niece. She called Marion Aunt Marion. She lived inside a fiction that denied her identity every day. The Hollywood community almost certainly knew. Gossip was the currency of the studio system, and a secret this large could not remain perfectly contained. But Hollywood understood power. Louis B. Mayer knew, Jack Warner knew, David O. Selznick knew, and all of them understood that Hearst's 28 newspapers could make or break a picture with a single editorial decision. A positive review in the Hearst press could fill theaters. A negative one could empty them. The silence about Patricia was not kindness, it was business. The emotional architecture was more complex than the financial one. Patricia grew up inside a family that was not what it appeared. The aunt who was really a mother, the family friend who was really a father, the cousins who were really half-siblings. The entire structure of her childhood was built on a fiction that everyone maintained and nobody explained. She may have sensed it, children often do, the way Marion held her, the way Hearst looked at her. The gifts that arrived on birthdays and Christmas that were too generous, too personal, too carefully chosen for the daughter of a sister. On her wedding day, Hearst pulled Patricia aside and told her the truth. He was her father. Marion was her mother. Everything she had suspected, everything she had half known, was confirmed in a private conversation on what should have been the happiest day of her life. The confession was quiet, decades overdue, and delivered with the same controlled precision Hearst brought to everything. It changed nothing on paper. Patricia was still Rose Van Cleve's daughter in every legal document, but it confirmed what she had probably suspected her entire life. And it placed on her shoulders a burden she would carry for another 40 years. The knowledge that her identity was a lie, told by the people who loved her most, sustained by a fortune she could never publicly claim. And then the silence resumed, for another 40 years. The silence was sustained by the same forces that sustained every Gilded Age secret. If the truth emerged while Hearst was alive, the consequences would fall on Marion and Patricia, not on Hearst. He controlled the newspapers, he controlled the narrative. Marion would be the disgraced mistress. Patricia would be the illegitimate child. The system was designed so that the people with the most to lose from exposure were the people with the least power to choose it. Chapter 9. A Deathbed Confession. 73 years in the making. Patricia Lake spent her entire life as a secret, and she died determined to become the truth. Hearst died on August 14, 1951, at 88. Still married to Millicent, still living with Marion, still hiding Patricia. His death was a masterclass in the cruelty of legal standing. The Hearst sons arrived at the Beverly Hills house where Marion and their father had lived together. They took charge. Marion was reportedly sedated. When she woke, Hearst's body had been removed. The funeral arrangements were made without her input. She was not listed as a survivor in the obituary. The woman who had shared his life for over 34 years, who had nursed him through illness, who had sustained him through the near collapse of his empire in the late 1930s, who had sold her own jewelry to keep his company afloat, was erased from the story of his death as completely as Patricia had been erased from the story of her birth. Marion married Horace Brown, a merchant seaman, within 11 weeks. The marriage shocked those who knew her. Some interpreted it as grief, others as defiance. She had spent 34 years as a woman without legal standing. The marriage to Brown was proof that she could choose, that she was not merely the thing a powerful man had kept. She was a woman who could sign her own name on a license. She died in 1961. Her estate was valued at $20 million. She left half of it to Patricia. The bequest was extraordinary for a niece. Half of a $20 million estate is $10 million. In today's money, it exceeds $100 million. It was the inheritance of a daughter. No aunt leaves half her fortune to a niece unless the niece is something more. The will was the final coded confession. The money Marion could never give publicly, she gave legally in a document that survived her silence. The probate court processed it without comment. Nobody asked the obvious question. Patricia lived for another 32 years after Marion's death. She married. She raised children. She lived in a world that had no idea who she was. She watched movies about her father's life, including Citizen Kane, and said nothing. She read biographies of Marion Davies and said nothing. She attended family gatherings where the Van Cleve fiction was maintained and said nothing. Patricia lived through decades that transformed the world around her while leaving her secret perfectly intact. She watched the women's movement demand equality and thought about her own silenced identity. She watched the civil rights movement challenge the structures of concealment and thought about the structures that concealed her. She watched Watergate prove that powerful men's secrets eventually surface and wondered when hers would. She read every biography of Hearst and every profile of Marion and measured the distance between what was written and what she knew to be true. The burden was not merely social, it was existential. Every introduction was a performance. Every family gathering required a lie. Every form that asked for her parents' names demanded a fiction. She was Rose Van Cleve's daughter on paper, and Marion Davies' daughter in fact. And the gap between those identities was a wound that never closed. She could not go to a therapist and say, "My parents were William Randolph Hearst and Marion Davies." She could not tell her closest friends. She could not tell her children. The secret was a prison she carried inside her body, and she had not committed the crime that put her there. Why did she stay silent? Loyalty to Marion, who had asked her to keep the secret. Fear of the Hearst family's legal and media power, which had already demonstrated what it could do to people who threatened the dynasty. The psychological weight of a secret maintained since birth, which had shaped her personality in ways she may not have fully understood. And perhaps the simplest explanation. The secret had become so embedded in her identity that revealing it felt like destroying herself. She had been Rose Van Cleve's daughter for so long that becoming Marion Davies' daughter meant becoming someone else entirely. In 1993, Patricia was dying of cancer. The disease stripped away everything except what mattered, and what mattered finally was the truth. She gathered her family. She told her son Arthur the truth. All of it. Who she was, who her parents were, why it had been hidden, and she asked him to make it public. After 73 years, she wanted the lie to end. Arthur published the revelation. The Hearst family, after initial resistance, acknowledged the claim. DNA evidence was not required. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The timing of the birth, the concealment in Paris, Marion's bequest of half her estate, Hearst's acknowledgement on Patricia's wedding day, and the simple fact that everyone who had been close to the family had always known. Think about what 73 years means. Patricia was born around 1919, during the last year of the First World War. She died in 1993, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. She lived through the entire arc of the 20th century, through the Depression, the Second World War, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, Watergate, the moon landing, and the age of personal computers. For all of those decades, the secret held. The architecture of silence that the Gilded Age perfected proved robust enough to survive the entire modern era. A secret born in the age of horse-drawn carriages was not revealed until the age of the internet. The moment of collapse was quiet, no courtroom, no tabloid headline, no lawyer wielding documents across a conference table, just a dying woman telling her son the truth and asking him to share it. After 73 years of performance, the most powerful act Patricia Lake ever committed was simply stopping. Patricia Lake died in 1993. She died as herself, the daughter of Marion Davies and William Randolph Hearst. In Chapter 10, The Law That Protected the Liars. The Gilded Age did not merely tolerate double lives. It built the legal infrastructure to sustain them. The foundation was coverture. Under this doctrine, a married woman had no independent legal existence. She could not own property. She could not sue. She could not sign contracts or draft wills. A wife who discovered her husband's double life had no independent means to challenge it. Leaving the marriage meant losing the home, the children, the income, and the social standing that constituted her entire world. The Married Women's Property Acts, passed state by state, beginning with New York in 1848, slowly eroded coverture, but legal reform outpaced social change by decades. A woman who technically had the right to own property still faced devastating social consequences for using that right to challenge her husband. Divorce required proof of adultery in New York, and pursuing it meant public scandal and social ostracism. The second pillar was bastardy law. Under common law, an illegitimate child was filius nullius, no right to the father's name, no right to the father's estate, no right to support unless voluntarily provided. In New York, formal acknowledgement was required before an illegitimate child could inherit. A wealthy man could father children across the city and owe them nothing at death, as long as he signed no papers. This was not a loophole. It was the system working as designed. The third pillar was the economy of silence. Colonel Manstown topics demonstrated that discretion had a market price. Vanderbilt's $25,000 in 1900 was roughly $750,000 in today's currency. Morgan's $2,500 was around $75,000. These were not small payments. They were the annual salaries of skilled professionals, handed over to suppress a single story. Every payment confirmed the same truth. The system worked because everyone within it had a financial interest in its continuation. Together, these forces created a perfect environment for double lives. Coverture prevented wives from acting. Bastardy laws prevented children from claiming. The economy of silence prevented the public from knowing. The man at the center held all the power. Everyone else survived at his discretion. Consider the arithmetic. Stillman's fortune exceeded $50 million. The cost of maintaining Florence Leeds' household was between $15,000 and $45,000 per year. That is less than 0.1% of his net worth. Huntington's railroad empire generated millions annually. Arabella's household expenses were a single line item. Hearst spent more furnishing one room at San Simeon than it cost to hide Patricia for a decade. The double life was not expensive. It was cheap. Cheap enough that the men who maintained them never had to choose between their public families and their hidden ones. The system was designed for men whose fortunes made the cost of secrecy invisible. The Supreme Court did not begin dismantling this architecture until the 20th century was well advanced. Levy versus Louisiana in 1968 ruled that illegitimate children had the constitutional right to sue for wrongful death. That case involved 5 children, born outside marriage, whose mother died from negligent medical care. The state of Louisiana argued the children had no standing because they were illegitimate. The Supreme Court disagreed. Trimble versus Gordon in 1977 struck down state laws preventing illegitimate children from inheriting. These decisions came nearly a century after the Gilded Age. For J. Ward Leeds, for Archer Huntington, for Patricia Lake, the legal protections arrived decades too late. For all the years between, the children born in the shadows had no standing the law was bound to respect. Chapter 11. The Color Line and the Longest Silence. The pattern of the hidden second family did not begin in Manhattan ballrooms. It began on southern plantations. Long before Stillman funded Florence Leeds' apartment, or Huntington arranged a sham marriage for Arabella, wealthy white men in the American South were maintaining families with enslaved women. The practice was so widespread, it shaped the demographics of an entire region. Thomas Jefferson is the founding example. His relationship with Sally Hemings lasted nearly 4 decades and produced at least 6 children. 4 survived to adulthood. Jefferson freed all of Hemings' children in his will. He did not free Sally. Several of their children passed into white society, disappearing across the color line. For 172 years, the Jefferson family and many historians denied the relationship entirely. They attributed Hemings' children to other men, to relatives, to anyone except the 3rd president. The denial was not merely personal, it was institutional. The story of American democracy required Jefferson to be a certain kind of man, and that man did not father children with a woman he owned. The lie was maintained because the truth was inconvenient for a nation's self-image. DNA evidence published in 1998 confirmed the relationship. In 2018, The Thomas Jefferson Foundation declared the matter settled historical fact. 172 years of denial, overturned by a laboratory test. The pattern was systemic. Samuel Townsend of Alabama fathered children with enslaved women. His estate, worth over $200,000 in the 1850s, was left to those children. The disbursements funded their education at Wilberforce University in Ohio. Amanda America Dixon was born in 1849 in Georgia. Her father was a white plantation owner who had assaulted her enslaved mother when the mother was 12. When her father died in 1885, his will left her the bulk of his estate, including 17,000 acres. His white relatives contested the will. They lost. Amanda became one of the wealthiest African American women in the 19th century. The pattern survived slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. Strom Thurmond, the segregationist senator who ran for president on a platform of racial separation in 1948, fathered Essie Mae Washington Williams with a 16-year-old black servant in 1925. He provided financial support throughout her life, paying for her education, but he never publicly acknowledged her. She revealed the truth only after his death, at 100 in 2003. The common thread is not race, it is power. The ability to create a child, sustain that child financially, and deny that child publicly. Jefferson had that power, Townsend had it, Thurmond had it, Stillman had it, Huntington had it, Hearst had it. The mechanism was identical, only the color of the silence changed, and the silence lasted longer. Jefferson's relationship with Hemings was denied for 172 years. Thurmond's daughter was hidden for 78. Patricia Lake was concealed for 73. J. Ward Leeds was acknowledged after roughly 2 decades, but only because a courtroom forced the issue. Archer Huntington's birth certificate was never corrected. The pattern is clear. The more powerful the man, the longer the silence endures. And the silence is always broken not by the man who created it, but by the child who inherited it, or by the grandchild who finally had nothing left to lose. The Southern pattern adds one dimension the Northern cases lack: the intersection of secrecy with the racial hierarchy. The Gilded Age husband who hid a child born to a chorus girl was hiding a social embarrassment. The plantation owner who hid a child born to an enslaved woman was hiding evidence that the entire racial order was fiction. The stakes were different, the silence was deeper, and the children paid a price that compounded across generations, because the lie was not merely personal, it was constitutional. It was woven into the laws, the customs, and the founding documents of a nation that declared all men to be created equal while building an economy on the bodies of people it classified as property. Chapter 12. The Truth That Always Surfaces. Every one of these stories ends the same way, with a piece of paper, a confession, or a test that the dead can no longer prevent. Stillman's double life ended in a courtroom, destroyed by his own petition. His wife named Florence Leeds because he named Fred Beauvais. The truth emerged not from conscience, but from retaliation. 2 people weaponized the same system, and the system collapsed under its own contradictions. Huntington's double life ended in an adoption certificate and a marriage license. The truth was absorbed rather than exposed. The kept woman became the wife. The illegitimate son became the adopted heir. The fortune transferred cleanly. The Huntington Library stands as the monument. Hearst's double life ended on a deathbed in 1993. Patricia Lake asked her son to tell the world who she really was. The confession came not from the powerful, but from the powerless. Not from the man who created the secret, but from the woman forced to carry it for 73 years. The Gilded Age built an architecture of concealment that was extraordinary in sophistication. Coverture silenced wives, bastardy laws erased children. The economy of discretion purchased the compliance of servants, journalists, and neighbors, but it could not hold forever. The will is the first crack. When a wealthy man dies, the probate court forces an accounting of his actual life, bequests to unnamed women, trusts for children who do not carry the family name, properties transferred to people with no apparent connection to the deceased. The will collapses the distance between the public man and the private one. The deathbed is the second crack. Patricia Lake waited 73 years. Essie Mae Washington Williams waited 78. Both waited until the powerful were gone. Both spoke only when silence no longer served anyone's interest but the dead. The DNA test is the third crack. The science that proved Jefferson fathered Heming's children was published 172 years after his death. The truth waited nearly 2 centuries. But it waited, and it surfaced. 3 men, 3 fortunes, 3 hidden families, 3 different outcomes. Stillman was destroyed by his own legal gambit. Huntington engineered a transfer so clean that the institution bearing his name celebrates it to this day. Hearst's secret outlasted every other secret of his era, surviving into the age of the internet before a dying woman finally broke it. The question this documentary asks is not who was wrong. The answer to that is obvious. The men who built these parallel lives chose their comfort over the dignity of every person they forced into the arrangement. The harder question is, who paid the price? The first wives who were deceived, Fifi Stillman, who discovered her husband's double life only when he accused her. Elizabeth Huntington, who lived and died without the legal power to challenge her husband. Millicent Hearst, who refused to grant a divorce for 4 decades and endured public humiliation as the price of her position. The second women who were hidden. Florence Leeds, who raised a son in a social void. Arabella, who spent 20 years waiting for a wife she never met to die. Marion Davies, who was kept from Hearst's deathbed by the family she had been excluded from for 3 decades. The children who inherited a lie. J. Ward Leeds, acknowledged only at the point of death. Archer Huntington, whose birth certificate carried a stranger's name until an adoption rewrite at 14. Patricia Lake, who spent 73 years as someone else's daughter and told the truth only as she was dying. Every child born in the shadows carries the same inheritance, not a fortune, not a name, not a position in the social register, but the knowledge that they existed because someone powerful enough to create them was also powerful enough to erase them. Do we forgive the men who built these worlds? Do we admire the women who survived them? Do we mourn the children who carried the weight? Or do we recognize that the system has not disappeared, that the architecture of silence, the financial machinery of concealment, the legal structures that privilege the acknowledged child over the hidden one, still operate, that the Gilded Age did not invent the double life, it merely perfected it, and that perfection, like the fortunes that funded it, has been inherited by every generation since. The truth always surfaces. It surfaces in courtrooms when a wife's lawyers produce evidence that a husband thought he had buried. It surfaces in probate courts when a will reveals bequests that make no sense unless you know the secret. It surfaces on deathbeds when a dying woman tells her son who she really is. It surfaces in laboratories when a DNA test settles a question that historians debated for nearly 2 centuries. The only question is how many lifetimes it takes, and who is left to hear it when it finally arrives. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you do not miss the ones still waiting to be told. Drop a comment and let me know. Which of these 3 men do you think committed the deepest betrayal? The banker who was exposed by his own wife, the railroad man who engineered a perfect escape, or the newspaper king whose secret outlasted everyone involved? I would genuinely like to know where you are watching from and what you make of all this. Share this on Facebook, in a group chat, or on Reddit. Every share, every comment, every conversation is the reason this channel keeps going.